Cool. Okay. So when the caffeine kicks in, this is what I'm hoping to talk about. It might take a sec. What I want to do first off is to talk about what we are positioning as dominant neurologically typical, so mainstream understandings of friendship. So the stuff that comes out of mainstream developmental psychology. What assumptions are they making about when children and adults make friends? What does having a friend look like? Not just as a person, but what elements of being a social being do you have to demonstrate in order to have a friend, or to convince other people, normally psychologists with their real or their imaginary clipboards, that you are capable of having friends. So we'll explore that as a backdrop to the work. Within that, we want to look at how people with autism are positioned within the kind of the mainstream understandings of friendship. And we want to give some examples, some very developing examples from some of the data that Hanna's produced in Sweden, and extend that a little bit. So I'd very much welcome some comments and feedback. So to look at the importance of space within thinking about how people make friends. In all of our work, and I hesitate to say this now, what we're trying to do is resist neuronormative assumptions, and by that I think what I'm saying is that we're trying to work from a position of valuing neurological difference, where I'm positioning neurology as a discursive product rather than a real entity. And so that's something that we try very hard to do within our work, is to kind of value that diversity. Okay. I'm trying to copy. So, the kind of from developmental psychology and moving out, obviously, from there, what we get is a very dominant view, taken for granted view of friendships and understandings of friendships. They very much seem to be an important part of normal childhood that is then the building block for appropriate adult kind of socialisation and friendships and so on. That within these dominant understandings, there are particular elements of sociality that are drawn on, kind of social behaviour that are drawn on to make friends and to recognise what behaviour that what behaviour constitutes having a friend and maintaining a friendship with someone. And so they're things like equal benefits from other for both people within the friendship. So cooperation, empathy, a liking for one another and a desire to spend time together, and an affectionate relationship. There is within the developmental literature a recognition of the complexities of friendship. It's not seen to be just one thing, but there's very much a spectrum of friendship, but this is still very much dominated with a kind of neurological, typical view of sociality and of being in the world. So psychologists go to great lengths to describe, well, what are the behaviours that signify a friend from a non-friend, a best friend from a good friend from an acquaintance, and alongside that, all sorts of elaborate, taken for granted, implicit social rules that enable us to enable developmental psychologists to make sense of those behaviours and to measure children mainly in their attempts to make friendships within that categorisation. So can children maintain friendships? Are they able to demonstrate differences in their behaviour between what would be considered a best friend and an acquaintance or somebody they've not met? So kind of very different kind of social expectations around those different categories. The assumption that comes from psychology, but I think is shared definitely within British culture, is that face-to-face friendship is still largely the most important element of the ways in which we make friends. I think that's changing slightly with the development of new technologies, but particularly for children, virtual friendships are still, I think, assumed to be inferior. That there's some examples in research of where interacting online for children with very specific health needs or disabilities on that very specific issue and having support from an online community where, for example, you're the only kid who's got renal failure in 20 miles and you can't get out, so actually talking to other children like you online is a pretty good kind of substitute really for what should really be happening, which is you should be out interacting with your mates in a face-to-face environment. And you can see this within the public sphere in the UK around some of the concerns about young people spending too much time online. We need to get them out in the fresh air and having real friendships, being with real people rather than virtual. And definitely with thinking about things like Facebook and some of the other social networking, a really kind of weird reconstitution of friends that's come about through Facebook in particular, and a scepticism of whether they can really be your friends. How can you really be friends with someone who you've not met? As if this it's so very much the kind of implicit rules about what friendship should involve. Okay. So set against that is the kind of developmental discourse around children and adults with autism, and the kind of still, I think, contemporary discourses of autism in terms of not just a difference, but often a damage, a deviation from the neurologically typical. And the positioning of children with autism as not being able to have friends, are not able to have the social skills and the attributes to make friends, and particularly within a developmentally appropriate way. So, for example, very little children may, many very small children, demonstrate what's by the developmental psychologists is called parallel play. So they'll be doing similar kind of things, they'll just be sat next to each other, but they're not really interacting. And this is really the developmentally appropriate, that it's seen within the kind of neurologically typical research on friendship that's a phase that children go through. So after a particular age, then actually that would be a developmentally inappropriate way in which you could kind of hang out with your mates. And obviously all the kind of the side discourse and the developmental literature around things like the supposed theory of mind, the deficits around theory of mind, are brought into this equation to explain why it is that that people with autism are unable to form friendships. And I think where there has been some research around encouraging children and adults with autism to engage in friendships, it's been really around intervention and around social skills training. So how is it that we can possibly teach these people to have friendships in a way that we would recognise? So how can we train them to not play in parallel but to interact more or whatever? So the move very much is from an intervention to produce more neurologically typical ways of being, rather than acknowledge different ways of having friendship. Okay. So we and others have become interested in kind of neurodiversity and in the notions of kind of social behaviour. And Ox and Solomon suggest that what we need to do is to conceptualise sociality as a whole range of different possibilities, that rather than just assuming it's one particular way of being, a neurologically typical way of being, but to be aware of and recognise different ways in which you can inhabit a social space that aren't necessarily the ones that are measured within the developmental discourse. And also, in terms of our work, Hanna and Charlotte and I have become very interested in disability geographies, and also drawing on some of the work within sexual geographies literature, and looking at space as a key way in which disableist practices are created and enforced, and to look at space as either what we would term as neuroseparate or neuroshared, with the the recognition that much public space is dominated by a neurologically typical way of being in the world, and actually can be hostile and alienating and chaotic for some people with autism. There are examples of neurologically separate space that I'll come on to and talk about in a minute, that are dominated by people with autism, and we're very interested in that, in trying to document and make visible different ways in which people can have friendships and develop this kind of social being. Okay. So, what I'd like to do is just give you some examples from some material of Hanna's, and Hanna mentioned this earlier, Project Empowerment and the magazine. It's a Swedish magazine that was called Empowerment, produced by and aimed at adults with autism. It was part of Project Empowerment, which was part of the National Society of Autism and Asperger's in Sweden. And this is part of an emergent self-advocacy movement. This is what happens when I read. I really don't want to read. An emerging self-advocacy movement in Sweden among adults with autism, as Hanna mentioned earlier, that the society itself was very much dominated by parents, but there alongside that there were a group of adults with autism who had a very active space within the society. And what we're presenting here draws on the contributions to the Empowerment magazine, including interviews with adults with autism on different issues, and letters and other contributions from adults with autism to the publication. So what I have are some initial thoughts about a thematic analysis around two themes. One is about the meaning of space, and one is about reformulating or reworking ideas about friendship. And as I said, really welcome some comments on this. So, I've also, in a very culturally imperialist way, I apologise to Hanna, renamed all of her Swedish participants. So I felt, so let me just own up to, yes, my obvious colonialist imperative here. So yes, so I do apologise. But obviously, what I wanted to do was to give name to the contributors, and in a very short space of time in which this presentation was written, not have time to ask Hanna how she'd name them. So very Anglo-centric naming of the participants here. So I do apologise. So what's interesting is the contributors to Empowerment draw heavily on the ASNT, so the autistic neurologically typical distinction, and that's very real in terms of the identity positions that were being played out within the contributions in the magazine, and the ways in which the autistic contributors to the magazine talk about feeling out of place in NT spaces, so feeling alienated, feeling just unable to navigate them, and that they're experiencing them as very hostile places. And so the need for an autistic space as a separate space where they're able to be themselves and to develop friendships and do all the things they want to do was very, very much in evidence in the magazine. And in some of the other activities that the society supported, like summer camps and conferences and so on. So, for example, here, Nikki's talking about, we should create a separate society for people with AS. This society should be named Aspergiana, where neurotypicals would have to come to camp once a year and take a course. So neurologically typical people are the ones who need to be educated and accommodate within an autistic space. So very much a kind of inversion of the way in which they feel in the dominant face-to-face world of their everyday lives. And the second quote here from Alex is really demonstrating that friendship and social interaction in the summer camp, because this was Alex talking about the summer camp and how brilliant it was. so the friendship and the social interaction with other people at the camp was really, really important. So talking here about, during dinner I had common interests which moved me to the depths of my soul, very unlike the deficit model from the developmental psychological literature on children with autism unable to have friendships. Let me just kind of interject that. To discuss with my companions at dinner. Then it was the dance. It was wonderful not to be dependent on a dance partner and their approval to join in the community and experience the joy of dance. So very much illustrating the kind of the enjoyment and the richness of the experience for that particular participant in the summer camp. I know other people have talked about this as well. The magazine published several articles in which what they were trying to do was provide concrete tips and self-help strategies for managing NT-dominated contexts. So all the kind of the weird NT stuff where lots of things are implicit and it's chaotic. So how do you manage that? How do you negotiate that? If you have to enter into that world, what do you do? And so George is here talking about the possibility of doing that, but very much a resistance to doing it all the time. You won't want to be like that, which is very much, in some other work we've done, a very strong discourse from particular groups of autistic people talking about why on earth would you want to be NT when being an NT is so problematic, it's so, it's so limiting cognitively in terms of what you can do. It's incredibly limiting. Why would you want to change to become like them? So Georgie here is saying, you can learn things, strategies, imitations, other tricks are useful on special occasions, but you couldn't live with them 24 hours a day. So the idea of intervention to make children with autism more neurologically typical and more acceptable obviously comes at high cost, very much illustrated by these adults here who are reflecting on possibly having gone through some of that. And in some of the other work that we've done, we've had examples of adults with autism talk about, well, I felt like Skinner's, what did Skinner use? Pigeons? I can't remember. But basically saying I felt like one of, the famous behaviourist psychologists, I felt like Skinner's pigeon. I felt like, they were just experimenting on me, and when I made the right response, that I got the reward. And why on earth would you want to put people through this kind of really weird and barbaric intervention? So very much a resistance to wanting to live within a neurologically typical space all the time, but to learn. The magazine published articles about how to help people navigate and to have ways in which you could be within that world if that's what you chose to do, or in which you were forced to live. But equally, a view within the contributors to the magazine that actually not having to do that was really useful. And Sarah here talking about, now I know that the most important thing is not being like everyone else. Why on earth would you want to be neurologically typical? What is most important is that I have social interaction with others to the extent and in the setting I feel comfortable with, and I think that's really key. It's just a shame it took me so many years before I understood that how I live my life is up to me, rather than being measured against the developmental norms. And again, so thinking about reformulation and the kind of hostility at times and the puzzlement from the contributors to an NT-dominated world. So Bobby here is talking about some of the illogicality, as he sees it, about kind of NT friendships. So coffee breaks at work and breaks in other settings are often problematic for people with autism and Asperger's. It can be difficult to grasp the point of small talk. Why bother with small talk with colleagues? For those of us with autism and AS, often prefer deeper discussions to shallow chat. Sometimes talking about the weather works. You can try and pick up on what others are interested in, so very much learning the tricks in order to navigate your way through, or to make a connection to something you know about the person. Some people think this stuff just saps their energy and isn't worth the trouble. So perhaps rather than trying to make children with autism more NT to make their friendships more recognisable as NT friendships, to recognise that actually friendships and sociality can be done in a whole variety of different ways, and that some spaces are actually more conducive to doing that than others. And Project Empowerment is one example of a space that Hanna, Charlotte and I have talked about in which that's possible. Okay. So, and this is very much about, a similar kind of quote, really, that that you can learn the tricks. Yeah, 5 minutes, cool. That you can learn the tricks. So Kathy here saying, so actually you start with the surface questions. That's your name, what you do, how old you are. Those questions just don't seem important to me anymore. Why bother with those when actually you could talk about the things that you really want to? So I'd like to just ask the person to tell me about their life. So, as I said, so there are lots of articles that are about tips and tricks about making friends within an NT-dominated space, but also resistance, quite strong resistance at times, within the Empowerment magazine and also within other spaces that we've looked at, to feeling that you have to perform these tricks. Wendy Lawson obviously talked about this and highlights for us the need to rethink understandings of friendships if we can have neurodiverse friendships, so some kind of neuro-shared spaces. And she suggests things like email and other new technologies, social networking and so on, can be a way forward, as it enables people to engage in friendships in the way that they wish. I'll skip that last bit. So an example here of that. So in our work, we've looked at empowerment, and we've also examined online communities and the benefits of them as ways of managing and negotiating friendships. And this is an example from a researcher called Chen, who's talking about social networking sites, that they thought that they were a few years ago, I believe that social networking sites were nuisances, which I was forced to join when too many friends sent me invitations. I suddenly realised that, and this is a checklist for Chen. With photos and names listed, I can keep track of my friends even when I have trouble with names and faces. All the background information of my friends are available to me to reference. Friends provide updates which I can use as a context to re-establish contact with them when I need to, when necessary. All my online communications are recorded and available to me to plan my next social exchange. Social exchanges in real life are simplified and emulated on Facebook. For example, pokes can be likened to a brief touch on the shoulder, but are in ways in which Chen, for example, obviously feels more comfortable. And Chen also says, unlike real life, I can maintain total control of the impression I create via my own profile and what I choose to share. So very much an illustration of the way in which particular kinds of spaces can be more or less enabling to a whole variety of different people. So, my provisional reflections. The contributions to Empowerment magazine and other examples outline other examples we've looked at are very much positioned as neuro-separate spaces, which are an enabling environment for people with autism to develop a sense of community, a place to have fun, a place to dance, develop and maintain friendships, and so on, in a backdrop of an NT-dominated world, which is often seeking to measure their abilities to be sociable against an NT norm which just doesn't do the job. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you. Any questions? I can drink coffee now. Jonathan, I told you not to talk. Come on.
No, I'm going to be nice now. Say I really enjoy that, Lindsay, thank you. I just have problems with like the notion of autistic space or neuro separate spaces. Should the focus not perhaps be, it's probably a utopian view, but would the focus not be better being put back on so-called neurotypical people in order to accept and embrace the difference within people.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I mean, it's I really take your point, and I think that's a point that kind of stems back to identity politics across the board, doesn't it? How much you need to be separatist or integrated, and I don't think that there's one. I don't think there's one answer to that. In that, I think at times being separatist, there's a whole kind of notion and concern around ghettoisation, and that's very, that's really keenly felt, particularly around the online discussion groups for adults with autism. But actually, they're safe and enabling spaces. So separatist spaces at times are really good, really enabling, really supportive. Equally, at times, being more attempting to change the agenda within a dominating and a mainstream culture is also really important. So I'm not sure I'd go as far as I think you're suggesting in saying, right, we need to make everything, completely shared, because I think there are points in time where both of those are good.
I just worry about fragmenting, and creating segments, and that is sort of you admitting and saying that you're different from the so-called norm, and in that you're reinforcing what is normal. But
trying to think how to answer that. I think what's evident for, Hanna can talk as well about the contributors to empowerment, but what's evident in some of the work that Charlotte and I have done with online communities is that the people in those communities are positioned as being not normal. So, in a way, the space allows them to construct a really positive and enabling identity in a way that they won't be able to do, I think, in other instances. I'm not sure that answers your question, but
it's just more of a realistic view, because what I'm suggesting never really can happen. So it's an alternative.
But also, people may not want it to happen.
What about spaces that slowly evolve over a period of time?
Yeah.
So rooms change, the dimensions of rooms are altered by furniture, different people, coming in different teams, working people entering and exiting, and just movement around the building sometimes. But spaces are constantly evolving and changing. My experience is a much more efficient kind of way to move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of these things are changing all the time, aren't they? So, and I think that's a really good thing. But to suggest that actually what would work best for everyone at all times is to bring everyone together, I'm really unsure about, because I think at times it's really nice to be separate. I'm not sure I want to share that. I think so. I worry about that kind of amalgamation sometimes. Yeah.
Half response to this, but also perhaps leading into another question. I have been involved in autistic spaces, including a couple of online forums, and also an organisation called Rosqvist, I don't know if you've heard of it, in the UK, which has, it sounds like what the Swedish Empowerment Project is, quite similar actually. It has an annual sort of conference, retreat kind of social event.
Okay.
And I'm actually quite critical of a lot of these autistic spaces because I find them too focused strictly on autistic issues to the exclusion of many other marginalisations and oppressions in society. And this is partly because before I was involved in autism-specific stuff, I was involved in the disabled people's movement as a wider movement, and my first introduction to specific autistic community was through that, and encountering a lot of other autistic people who didn't have that background, and had a very autism-specific background, had quite, not necessarily always separatist, but quite like kind of autism is the only difference they care about kind of approaches. My question, I suppose, would be the autistic people who you surveyed, were they very into that, like autism was the only sort of axis of difference that they cared about, or did they try and bring other parallel things? Well, I mean, like you were talking about homonormativity earlier, and I think a lot of autistic spaces have a kind of like autistic normativity that's extremely parallel to that. And I'm wondering whether the autistic people you surveyed seem to be expressing that, or whether any of them were more critical of that and trying to have a more broader view of sort of, you know, difference and challenging normativities in general.
Okay, I'm going to hand over to Hanna in a sec. Oh, can we finish? Oh, could I just say, please, just very, very quickly, I absolutely acknowledge your point that what I may have presented is a real idealised view of, oh, look, separate spaces are all really cool and everyone in them, you know, that assumption of sameness is problematic, and I absolutely take that. And definitely in the online work that we've done, there are huge differences and really quite hostile differences about that take place within them. It's not straightforward. But in terms of the work that we've presented today, which comes from the Empowerment magazine, I'm going to hand over very briefly to Hanna.
Yes. And I think that magazine empowerment is very normative. So there's a difference as other kinds of thoughts and stories outside of this magazine, which are critical. For instance, the grooming kind of Ask a Queer movement is really critically, which are trying to form a kind of intersection between the queer movement and the Asperger movement, and therefore we kind of new space in between. And they made, I haven't interviewed some of them yet, but I read some texts by them, and that is kind of, but that's just a comment.
I suppose there's a difference if the space is constructed for people, or if people have ownership and say over how the space is constructed as well.
Yeah. But also to recognise, like your point in the back, that actually sometimes in assuming sameness, what we're doing is prioritising one element of identity, and actually it's very complex. There are all sorts of other things that come into play, and so that can be problematic too.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of what I was saying.
Yeah.
That, you know, I'm not only autistic, I'm a lot of other things as well, and I actually find it quite uncomfortable to be in spaces where that's the only axis of difference that's regarded as relevant to me or to everyone in that space. Yeah, yeah, absolutely agree. I think it's a good time to stop, Dan. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and deliver my paper in progress. And it's been in progress for some time because they keep making the teacher at work, so it kind of gets slowed down. But I apologised earlier to some of you who I know have heard it before. I have tried to put in one or two kind of newish things, but those I apologise to told me that they weren't actually listening when I delivered it. And also I keep delivering it because I'm determined, or have been determined, that one day Catherine Runswick-Cole would actually stop and listen to it. Now, Catherine has just arrived, assuming I would have finished it by now. So I'm very grateful that our schedule has changed a bit. And I hope my time hasn't started yet, because this is just my...
You've got 5
minutes. Yeah. Because I'm going to read my paper, because my relationship with the language around autism, and how autism is described and positioned, really, has changed over the years. I come from a teaching background in school. I was very much based in the individual model view of autism, and my thinking has shifted, but if I start to try and articulate without having carefully thought about it, I slip back into old modes of expression, which I'm trying to move on from. And I have to say that when I write a paper and I practice it, reading it to Teddy in my office, it goes much quicker than it does when I present it. And I never learn, that Teddy just doesn't doesn't interrupt. So I think. Okay, so the title of my paper, which is probably the same kind of developing paper that some of you will have heard under a different title, but it's shifted a bit. It's Counselling, Autism and the Problem of Empathy. Now, if you hadn't already seen the abstract for this presentation, I would have begun by asking you to reflect on your own reading of the title for a moment, and to be alert to your own expectations of what this presentation is about. And a good friend of mine and colleague, Rebecca Mallet from Sheffield Hallam University, told me you would be far too sophisticated an audience for me to kind of lure you in, so I haven't even tried really. But my guess was that for some people on reading that, their immediate thought might have been that the focus of this presentation is on the impaired ability of people on the autism spectrum to empathise with others during the counselling process, because so powerfully positioned is this dogma in our formation of the autistic being. However, this is not what this presentation is about. And my presentation now says put up slide 2. See? I've kind of covered every angle, hopefully. So instead, the focus of this paper is on using the experiences of people described as being on the autism spectrum to illustrate the extent to which ableism has infiltrated even the counselling room. And I say even because I began this review expecting to find that the counselling room is an enlightened space where disabled people are understood, appreciated and empowered. Instead, I found that some counsellors can only interpret and understand human experience through the normalcy lens. They forget that their system of being in the world and the sense that they make of their experiences is not necessarily universal. Counsellors neglect, as Tchaikovsky 2007 frames it, to watch their watching and read their readings. Neglecting to do this often then leads counsellors to misplace the problem in the individual rather than in disabling environments. Through approaches such as psychotherapy, counsellors try to restore a normal self within a client who is not necessarily biologically configured in ways that will allow him or her to ever meet the requirements of being normal, as these are currently constituted. The results of such misinformed practices are lengthy and expensive engagements that only frustrate and discourage both the counsellor and the client. Put up slide 3. Even though it says that, I start to panic that my slides aren't matching up with what I'm saying. And just for those of you where slides aren't helpful, just let you know that I've just summarised some key points from the paper. There's nothing new that I'm putting up on a slide that I'm not articulating here. So this is I'm going to start with my kind of back-out clause, really. And I'm going to make it very clear that I'm not an expert on counselling, for those of you who are already thinking of your challenging questions there. I have some personal experience of the process, and from that I do believe that counselling has value, in that it can help significantly in supporting us with understanding our performative selves, in the sense that Butler uses that. The self that carries out consciously and unconsciously the expectations placed upon us in relation to our gender, class, race, sexuality, and most significantly here, our bodily, cognitive and emotional configurations. Counselling can, at the very least, help us to recognise that we are to a significant extent the product of others' making. And so the responsibility for when we find ourselves being out of place, as Kitchen terms it and as Lindsay and Hanna used in their paper, it is not necessarily our fault. I also hold that counselling can be a restorative, which I always find difficult to say, an enabling experience. And even though I find it hard to say, I've chosen restorative here rather than therapeutic, because again, it alludes to the act of returning to the fundamental self. That counselling can enable people to find their way back to who they want to be, really. So I'm defining the fundamental self in this context as a performative self that is less problematic for the individual who inhabits it. But before I go further, as this paper relies upon the example of autism to elucidate how ableism operates in the counselling room, I should make explicit my current position in relation to the concept of autism itself, as to whether I see it as something real, a condition that can be had, or as a myth, to cite Timothy Gardner and McCabe, as only a socially constructed notion and not a biological reality. I stand here at the moment, as I'm always confused about this issue, with Ian Hacking, who in 2009 stated, "I take for granted that underneath the spectrum is a family of definite biological conditions, be they neurological or genetic or whatever, but that in an important sense, the spectrum itself is a moving target that has evolved dramatically." My interpretation of Hacking's view here is that human beings are physically constructed in differing ways. For some, this will mean that they're more interested in objects than people. The system for decoding social messages might not be so accessible to them, and aspects of the world might appear too nebulous to keep track of without imposing some sort of personal system of order and control. The observance of these ways of being in people can lead to a label of autism. And of course, as with all labels, autism also carries with it a whole range of assumptions, expectations, and limitations that others may well apply to people with the label, regardless of whether they may or may not be relevant to them. As this paper also considers how ableism insidiously invades even the counselling room, I perhaps should identify the definition of ableism that I'm working to. Fiona Kamari-Campbell describes the project of ableism as the compulsion... Oh, look, see, I ignored mine. Put up slide 5. Oh, good, where it's corresponding. Campbell describes the project of ableism as the compulsion to emulate ableist regulatory norms, resulting in a network of beliefs, processes and practices that cast disability as a diminished state of being human. Leonard Davis, by the grafting of an analogy from Michael Berube, beautifully for me captures the essence of ableism by defining it as the psychological distance most people put between themselves and disability. So ableist processes and practices then become all those things that normates, and I'm using the Garland-Thompson definition there of people who can represent themselves as definitive human beings. So all the things that normates do that enable them to pretend that impairment does not exist, to manage their own fear of the temporality and fragility of being by moving disabled people to the sidelines, to deny, to use another Garland-Thompson's term, bodily configurations that do not permit the myth of eternal life and continual beauty. So to return to Ian Hacking, he also talks about the way in which diagnosis and labelling supports this process of distancing by making up kinds of people that normates can then legitimately see as being far removed from their own experience and anticipated futures. Of course, I reject both ableism and its tool of making up kinds of people, but I find that this then presents me with a dilemma. As within this paper, I'm arguing that people on the autism spectrum do require counsellors to enter into different modes of thinking and being in order to provide people on the autism spectrum with effective support. I worry that by doing so, I'm encouraging counsellors to see people who are on the autism spectrum as a different kind of people, with the risk that they are then interpreted as being of a lesser inferior and diminished kind, who can only benefit from specialised and segregated services. People on the autism spectrum may then be seen as the victims of their own biological construction, for whom counselling has nothing to offer, rather than as people who are suffering from the challenge of managing hostile and exclusionary ableist environments. Now, this is certainly not what I intend, and I am not asking counsellors to engage with different kinds of people. Rather, I am urging them to reflect on whether their own perceptions of how people experience the world are unduly limited, to consider whether they are trapped within their own particular narrative, and thus prevented from imagining unknown ways of being, perhaps through a loyalty to particular creeds of counselling that proselytise particular understandings of what it means to be human. Rather than counsellors colluding with making up kinds of people, I want them to recognise that people can exist in the world in many different kinds of ways, some of which may be beyond the counsellor's current knowledge and understanding. So why did I write this paper? The main motivator for me to write this paper was my frustration at not having the resource to support people who identify as being on the autism spectrum when they approach me as an academic who lectures on the topic, looking for ongoing assistance with understanding and negotiating the social world. I'm distressed by how painful and potentially harmful it is for some people without a guide to try and operate in a social world that Atwood describes as a minefield in a jungle populated by predators. It seems to me that counselling, as I interpret the activity, could well be an effective mechanism of support. But I cannot find clear and easy funding routes for people through to counselling. Recommending that people access this through their local doctor without supporting them with making the appointment and making their case is often not enough. And even if such appointments were enabled, I wonder if there are sufficient counsellors out there who will be skilled enough to support people on the autism spectrum. Some of the examples that I'll give within this presentation will illustrate that qualifications in psychology, psychiatry, psychotherapy and counselling do not seem to be sufficient in themselves to enable a bridging of what Mackenzie and Leach-Scully referred to as different epistemic positions. It's actually a very difficult and challenging process to understand ways of inhabiting the world that are very different from one's own. Initially, I expected that empathy and the appreciation of others' experiences would be more developed in counsellors through the value given to supported self-reflection during training and practice. But I now wonder if ableism puts some sort of ceiling on the development of empathy, that even within a reflective context, we can only imagine what it means to be in the world within the boundaries of a familiar, shared, expected and permitted existence. My expectation when I first started to explore experiences of counselling in the literature was that the process would lend itself naturally to understanding difference, that counsellors would be expert in identifying, responding to and enabling individual ways of being. I was surprised, therefore, to come across Donna Reeves' 2000 account of how the disabling processes that operate within society are also reflected in the counselling room. Reeve identifies that there are barriers for disabled people to even get as far as the counselling room in the first place. The cost can be prohibitive, for example, for disabled people who often have fewer financial resources. Digby Tanton, thinking about Asperger's syndrome in particular, identifies additional barriers. These include a lack of awareness by people on the autism spectrum of the facility of counselling and how it might help them. Some people with autism may focus only on the need for the world to change and not perceive of themselves also having to do some things differently. There might be a fear of revealing oneself as autistic, or practical issues such as actually locating a counsellor, finding the venue and arriving to a set time. Counsellors themselves might set up further barriers. If a potential client discloses a label, some counsellors may feel that this needs specialist support that is outside of their expertise, as Raffensperger identified. As I went further into the literature, I encountered other illustrations of counselling, psychology, psychotherapy practice that concerned me, and I began to lose confidence that counselling would always be a positive and empowering experience for disabled people. So to illustrate this, I'd now like to share with you an example of ableist assumptions disrupting the psychoanalytic process that is described in an article by a psychoanalyst, Vera Regina Fonseca. Now, I chose Vera as an example because I love the name and I love to keep saying it to Teddy. But also, it's my great fortune that she resides in Brazil. And Brazil is a long way from Sheffield. And I think it's unlikely we will share the same space where she can come up and punch me. Because I am a bit critical about it. So, Vera's writing, I probably should say Fonseca's writing, it's like sort of a bit, minimalist there, but is a piece of writing that seems to speak with great authority about autistic ways of being in the world. And yet I can find no reference within it to how people on the autism spectrum themselves define and speak of their experiences. Instead, the article seems only to be based on outdated theories of autism from 30 years previously and the author's own prior academic outputs. The article is entitled "The Autistic Dialogic Style, a Case of Asperger's Syndrome," and it recalls the history of 9 years of psychoanalysis endured, see where I'm coming from, by a boy whom Fonseca names as Arthur. But of course, he might have had a Swedish name, I now realise. I don't know. Probably a Brazilian one, actually, wouldn't he? Portuguese, yeah. At the time of her writing the article, Arthur was 12, and he had experienced 3 therapy sessions a week since he was 3 years old, from which, according to Fonseca's account, he seems to have received very little benefit. Oh, can you believe it? For the initial 5 years, Arthur had a different analyst, until that therapist died. And so funny. That wasn't a funny bit. We've got our emotions all over the place, haven't we? And Fonseca took over Arthur's therapy. Although Fonseca does not directly state this, the reader is left wondering if Arthur bored the original therapist to death, as the main part of the article focuses on Fonseca's problems with staying awake during her sessions with Arthur, and I suspect that she was secretly worried that she might suffer an identical fate. And I kind of learnt from the hero's presentation today that that was like a common thing about therapists talking about being bored by their clients.
I don't think it was. I think people I was reading thought it was unusual to be bored.
Oh, did they?
Just in defence of them, they didn't think this was unusual. That's what attracted their interest.
Yeah. But there's obviously a tradition of being prepared to talk about being bored. That's kind of seen as kind of okay. And Fonseca frames it as, since the beginning, the sessions with Arthur have had the effect of making me very drowsy. This is how I imagine her speaking in her mind as she writes. Later, from her therapy note, she recalls, it's very hot, it's in Brazil. And the mere sight of Arthur in the waiting room is enough to make me drowsy. And I don't know if Arthur's family were paying for these 3 times a week sessions, but there's no mention of any money being returned for the psychoanalyst sleeping on the job. Although critical of her tendency to nod off, I do have some sympathy for Fonseca's predicament, however, as upon reading one of her sentences, namely, I consider this vertex, which is related to dialogism, most interesting because it can be used to describe bidirectional transactions within the dyadic space. And that's not even a complete sentence. I was experiencing the strongest of desires to fall asleep myself. Now, you might well have been thinking, oh, at last, Nick's used a kind of interesting sentence, but I'm quite happy to accept that the reason for my sleepiness is my own paucity of language, which makes understanding such sentences a struggle for me. Fonseca, however, perhaps free to do so by ableist presumptions of deficit, a word that Fonseca uses a lot in reference to Arthur, places all the responsibility and blame for the tedious nature of their relationship on him alone. For example, she states, as far as affect is concerned, he drained every emotion from the relationship. The reason they do not connect, according to Fonseca, is because of autism. Nothing to do with her having indulged in a heavy lunch before sessions, which she reports in the text, or not knowing how to stimulate and engage with Arthur beyond the same psychoanalytic tools of talking and drawing that she trots out for all clients. I'm getting a bit rude here. Ableist assumptions abound within this short text. Fonseca is surprised by what she finds to be Arthur's flat vocal expression and gaze, as he has the look of a healthy and normal boy. For Fonseca, Arthur's modus operandi would seem therefore to be an illness, rather than a legitimate expression of simply being. Arthur likes trees, and he usually draws them. On one occasion he drew some that were bent by a tornado, and this seemed to excite him. To Fonseca, who seems only to be able to operate in a world of feelings, social connections and human bonding, the reason for this is clear. It seemed, she says, that this was his way of depicting the annihilation anxiety triggered by his first analyst's death. Now, I'm not insisting that this interpretation is wrong. I'm simply arguing that it is but one interpretation, and one that is made through an ableist lens. Fonseca offers no reason for this explanation, and I feel it says more about the limitations of her own worldview than about Arthur's. For Fonseca appears to have no ability to conceive of a life world in which trees are more interesting than people. Nor is there any logic to her claim. Fonseca's whole argument is based on the concept, as she puts it, that the central problem in autistic disorders is the acceptance and tolerance of otherness. So at the same time as claiming an autistic rejection of the other, Fonseca asks us to accept that Arthur is so traumatised by the loss of another that he needs to play this out in therapy, that only in the form of drawing can these feelings be managed. It simply makes no sense. So blinkered by ableism is Fonseca, and so embedded within the beliefs and practices of psychoanalysis that she is unable to accept that for some people, other people don't do anything for them. They are perhaps of very little interest, do not capture the attention. I'll assume you're not just waving there then. 5 minutes. Go, oh yeah, I'll do it. Just always say you'll do it and carry on. That's nice. Who needs lunch, when I'm talking? It seems to me here that for Fonseca, and this is for those of you who have heard it before, wake up now, this is like the new bit that I'm just playing with and trying to put in. Playing with means I don't really understand it, but I'm putting it in English. Seems to me here that for Fonseca, Arthur is, to use Buber's term, an it rather than a thou. As an it, Arthur is merely a unit of commerce whose continued attendance at psychotherapy is required to make this appear a valid practice, and Fonseca is capable of performing it. Fonseca has not worked to create an I-thou relationship, whereas Hess frames that to retain their individuality, delight in how they meet, yet respect that there are fundamental differences between the two. In an I-thou relationship, Fonseca will be actively seeking to understand who Arthur is and what being Arthur means for him. Instead, Fonseca is placing all the responsibility for their relationship on Arthur alone, and is using autism to excuse her from watching her watching and reading her reading. Sadly, in doing so, Fonseca is missing the opportunity to develop as a therapist and a person, to learn more about her own tastes, preferences and limitations, to quote Hess, and to establish a valid therapeutic relationship with Arthur. Some might argue that the problem here is not Fonseca, those of you who are kinder than me, but the tools that she's trying to work with, that psychoanalysis is an interpersonal approach that is dependent upon a client having a developed sense of the other. Koenig and Levine, however, argue that psychotherapy does have something to offer people on the autism spectrum, so as long as therapists are prepared to alter their previously established processes and rules for therapeutic engagement. And Digby Tantum again argues that for people with Asperger's syndrome, this will require counselling to be based around the client's subjective experience of Asperger's syndrome. And in fact, I would apply this principle more widely by arguing that effective counselling needs to be based around any client's subjective experience of being, that this is always essential for the creation of an I-thou relationship. In doing so, counsellors might well benefit from using what Donna Williams, a writer who identifies as being on the autism spectrum, termed the inside-out approach. Williams calls for professionals to cast aside their textbooks on how life should be and focus on how life really is for the individual in front of them. And it seems to me that Fonseca's example is an illustration of what happens when an outside-in approach is applied. In spite of this, Fonseca did feel that Arthur made some progress in his engagements with her, but the developments identified came for me at far too high and unnecessary a cost for Arthur and his family. And as Donna Williams points out, for the gains claimed by Fonseca, there are often cheaper ways to achieve this than trip to the psychotherapist's office. And such examples certainly serve to highlight that ableism is definitely a work in the counselling room, and that this carries a heavy cost for disabled people. Now, I think Dan's probably not going to let me go on any longer to my conclusion, where I very skillfully bring it all together in a way that as I look at in wonder, actually, as I look at my words. And I also refer to Dan's 2011 text, where he warns...
Got 10 more minutes.
Yeah, I've got it in my head. I'll just put that bit in there. Where actually, I think I'll finish on those two things. I'll finish with Dan. Where Dan warns to always view psychoanalysis with healthy scepticism rather than deluded affiliation. So important not to become wedded to ontologies that position the problem within the client and not the world around them. And goodly, and this made me think really of, I think it was Sarah, who might have been called Agneta at one time, whatever. That's the only other Swedish name I know, really, yeah, or Frida. Frida or Agneta or Hanna, the only Swedish names. Where Sarah said, "Now I know that the most important thing is not being like everyone else." So that ability to say, actually, you're all right. It's not you who's the problem, it's the world around you. And Goodley argues that psychoanalysis might be at its most powerful when employed to make sense of organisational prejudice and discrimination against disabled people. And this, to finish with Campbell, may then help clients with healing some of the injuries inflicted by the violence of ableism. Thank you. Go on then.
Second time I've heard that paper, it's brilliant.
Only twice.
When you say ableism, do you mean psychologisation? Because I'm wondering about, because it seems to be the root of the problem for the Brazilian therapist is that she can only see the problems in this very psychologising lens within Arthur. And of course ableism is always lurking, isn't it, around those kind of processes. But I'm wondering if what you're highlighting to us is the dangers of psychologisation. And with that in mind, what are the dangers of drawing upon people like Tanton, who has made a career out of the psychologisation of autism?
Yes. Oh, second bit's interesting, isn't it? I think, yeah, what I probably see with Fonseca as the problem is I think it's like that for many of us, our lives are probably quite restricted and quite narrow. And I think what I love is they're turning these things on their head, that people talk about one of the problems with autism, isn't it, is impaired imagination. But it's actually very difficult to imagine things that you haven't ever experienced. And we kind of all go along on the assumption that the people around us feel in the way that we feel, they sense in the way that we feel, and that the environment, their relationship with the environment is similar to ours. And I think that just isn't right. And I think it's kind of very individual, and it's very difficult. And that's what Donna Williams is talking about. She's saying that we all have individual systems for being in the world. And she's talking about autism in particular, and she says, well, if you want to know that person, then what are you going to do? You just, maybe through their behaviour, you'll learn bits of their system, you'll be able to piece it together. And maybe it will take you 20 years. She says, but what else are you going to do? You know, it's about developing relationships with people, really. And I think why I get cross with Fonseca is I think Ian Hacking talks about thin people. He's not agreeing with it necessarily, but he talks about, so Judy Singer, for example, who identifies as being on the autism spectrum, and she talks about her daughter who's on the autism spectrum, and Judy Singer does a lot of stuff for Autism Speaks. And she responds to critics who say, why are you working for an organisation that focuses on eradicating autism and focuses on cure rather than celebrating difference and appreciating difference? And she says, well, it's all right for people that write about their autobiographies, their autism autobiographies, where they're having kind of rich, creative lives, where they've got social engagement and they have a lot of things going on for them. And she says, for my daughter, it's different. Her life is much more restricted in terms of how Judy interprets that, really. And so Ian Hacking poses that issue about, are we saying then that the autobiographical accounts are written by thick people, which is quite interesting, like use of that term, really, but in a positive way. But they can't represent the lives of people with maybe severe learning difficulties who are not using standard forms of communication. They can't represent them because they are thin people and have thin lives, really. And I think I really have an instinctive revulsion for that idea of some people being thin people. I think it's just that we are maybe the person working with them is too thin to be able to access the thickness of that person. So I wanted Fonseca to find Arthur to be thick, really. Yeah, I think that's probably my thing, really. And Digby Tanton, that's kind of, it's sort of, I think sometimes you get the good with the bad, don't you? And I think what I use Digby Tanton's work for and what I appreciate about what he's done is about he has promoted, I think in some ways, a perspective of people on saying, look, this is what the people I'm seeing are telling me that they are finding problematic about society. This is how I think society needs to change, and this is what we need to watch our watchings, and we need to look at how we're conceptualising these people and learn how to value them, really. So I think that's what I kind of probably appreciate about it. And also he's based in Sheffield, so I can't slag him off like I can people in Brazil. Yeah, if he moves, that maybe. Oh yes, Donna, sorry.
It's only I think I'm wondering how much of this ableism in the counselling room is also linked to the fact that it's very difficult to get counsellors to engage politically with the outside world, because there's this kind of, it's all in the room, what's happening here is what's important, and a reluctance to engage with the fact this person's out of work because, you know what I mean, the bigger picture, and then there just seems to be an avoidance of that. It's almost like they want a nice sanitised middle class view of the world, and I think that's why it's difficult to get them to engage with this stuff.
Because it's kind of, and you can see why, can't you? Because you can kind of think, wow, in the way that it's set up, is that because I think that's one of the things I probably argue in the conclusion is that actually there might be some benefit that you can help someone to see that actually it isn't them, they're not odd, or they are not a completely negative person, and it might be in terms of emotions. That we were talking about this, that they're not someone who can't be desired, or they're not someone who can't be loved if that's what's important to them. That it's issues outside of them and around them. It's that relationship. So you can get people to take the blame off themselves. So that might have a psychological benefit. But if you need to live in an environment that's calm and relaxed, and you can control your own space, and you're living in accommodation that's damp, noisy, where people bully you, like inside your home as well as outside your home, counselling isn't going to change those things. And maybe what a counsellor can do is maybe support people in maybe identifying strategies that they can do, or maybe people they could access to do that. Maybe if you help people see that the problem isn't you, the problem is out there, and therefore someone should be doing something about the problem out there. But there's those issues, but then it's that same thing. Will you ever get to see a counsellor if your finances mean that you're living in that type of accommodation or whatever? But certainly, and Raffensperger talks about the need for counsellors to maybe do therapy online, to come out of, not see it's just seeing someone in a room, to maybe work with the people around that person who know that person can support that person, to broaden it out to the family. So, I think that is really important.
It can make me think, what kind of counselling would there be for people on the autism spectrum that aren't part of that speaking and listening process?
Yes. Well, because that kind of really resonates with your sort of work, doesn't it? And in your presentation, I think it'll be interesting to think about actually what's the counselling process in that, really. And I think part of what your work, Tom, is about, you're getting people to rethink the way that they think about the people they know with autism, and in a way through that rethinking process they will engage with them differently, and there will probably be a counselling element within that really. So
that's exactly. I was thinking, how would those students that I'm working with access this type of situation, take part in that experience?
I think
they cut out from that as a possibility.
I think for me, counselling is about helping people to see what they're comfortable with and what they're not comfortable with. It's about helping that developing kind of self-awareness. And maybe for some people, it's about getting other people to start thinking about, well, that person's telling me, not through language, but through their behaviour, that every time I do this, they kind of cover their ears, or they leave the room, or they bite themselves. And do I think they're biting themselves because this is a positive, they're experiencing this in a positive way, or do I think that they're saying, help, I need something to change here?
But maybe counselling for that group could take place in a playground at home with the correct approach to observing and interpreting those behaviours, and it wouldn't be a £20 for the hour session. It would be an ongoing, revolving.
And part of that, it's like just thinking of Leonard Davis and interdependence rather than independence, is I think we've also become a bit of a society where we think you can only engage with other people if you've been on a course. It's kind of like, so I don't know that you can need the particular package or you need the particular training. I think you just have to be focused